good to be here today. It's good to be here with each of us together today. I like the readings this morning because they represent hope in the light of despair.
Amen.
Whether it's Revelation, talking about the end when we will celebrate in heaven forever, or whether it's the disciples that are struggling with this new way of life and all that they've been through since Easter. And it reminded me that, that probably in each of our lives, sometimes despair and hopelessness creep in. And I don't know how many have had times today or this week or recently where you've just felt discouraged. And then God in His faithfulness comes through. Isn't that wonderful? That God never leaves us alone to wallow in our despair, but He comes to us. He brings us aid. He comforts us. He brings us people together that will help us see Him and see His work in our life. And I don't know where you find yourself today, but if you're experiencing that or have experienced that, then this message is for you. Because this is a message of hope in times of despair. Amen. The fishermen, the disciples, these were guys who were fishermen, right? Yeah. Who likes to fish? I do too. I like fishing. I really, really like fishing, but there is one big problem. I like catching. Well, that's true. That's the problem. I'm not very good at catching. I mean, you can put me in a boat. You can give me all the best gear. You can hand me a bucket of fresh bait and a cooler full of ice-cold beer, and I will look like the best fisherman in the world. But the problem is if my family wants fish for dinner that night, I have to stop by Publix seafood department on the way home. You know, here's what I know about fishing. I believe fishing is not primarily about catching fish. At least this is what I have come to believe. Fishing is more about having a good time with friends and family and enjoying the sun and the water and especially that cooler full of ice-cold beer on the boat. Now I know that some guys are better at it than others, but what is important is that you have a good time, right? Take a look at these guys, for instance. They seem to be enjoying themselves. Well, there's a couple other guys that are enjoying themselves maybe a little bit more. As you can see, some were better at catching fish than others. But there's one thing that everyone in our group that day was good at. And that's telling fish stories. Amen. You see, every single one of us that went on our fishing trip last October could stretch the truth and talk about the big one, right?
Yeah.
See, isn't there something about fishing that just makes us want to exaggerate a little bit? It reminds me of the story about the fisherman. Fisherman who'd been married for a long time, and he and his wife were blessed with sons, twin sons. They loved the children very much. But they couldn't think of what to name them. Finally, after several days, the fisherman said, let's not decide on names right now. If we wait a little while, their names will occur to us. Well, several weeks had passed. The fisherman and his wife started to notice some peculiar characteristics about these twins. When they were left alone, one of the boys would always turn and face the sea, while the other boy would always turn and face the land. Now, it didn't matter which way the parents positioned the children, the end result was always the same. The children always faced the same two directions. So the fisherman had an idea. He said to his wife, he said, let's call the boys towards and away. His wife agreed. And from that point on, the two boys were simply known as towards and away. Well, the years passed. The lads grew tall and strong, and the day came when the aging fisherman said to his sons, boys, it's time that you now learn to make a living from the sea. You must continue in the family business, and it is now time to learn. So they provisioned their ship said their goodbyes to their mother, and set sail for a 3-month voyage. 3 months came and went. Then 6 months with no word from the men. The wife started to fear the worst. She waited and waited, watching day and night for their return. 3 whole years later, they had passed with no word. The grieving woman, standing alone on her front porch, finally saw the figure of a lone man walking towards her house. She recognized him as her husband. "My goodness, what happened?" she cried. "Where have you been, and where are my darling boys?" The ragged fisherman began to tell his story. "We were just barely 1 whole day out to sea when Torrance hooked a great fish. Torrance fought long and hard, but the fish was more than his equal. For a whole week they wrestled upon the waves without either of them letting up. Yet eventually the great fish started to win the battle. And with a giant tug, Torrance was pulled over the side of our ship, and with my own eyes I saw him get swallowed whole, right before the giant monster of the deep descended. And we never saw either of them again." "Oh my goodness, that's terrible," said the wife. "What a huge fish it must have been. What a horrible, horrible monster." "Yes, it was," said the fisherman. "But that wasn't the worst of it. You should have seen the one that got away." Yeah, it's a groan, right? See, every good fish story has it, right? There's a really good reason why people look suspiciously on fishermen's tales. Something about the sport lends itself to big stories. So how do you think the people reacted when Simon Peter and the other disciples returned from their fishing trip with tales of seeing the risen Jesus? Don't you believe that folks just shook their head and said, "Fishermen, can't believe a word they say"? But we must take into account that the disciples were just as surprised as everyone else to see Jesus. You see, that's the last thing they expected to see when they headed out to fish that day. A visitor to a small town watched an old man fishing quietly in a shallow stream. For about a half hour, there was no sign of activity. Finally, the visitor walked over and said to the old man, he said, "It doesn't look like there are any fish in this stream." "Nope," said the old fellow, "there ain't." "Then what's the object of fishing here?" said the visitor. "The object," replied the old man, "is to prove to my wife that I have no time to peel potatoes." What was the disciples' object of going out fishing that night? See, I think the disciples were still in a state of shock. Amen. Still a little despondent. You see, the world had just collapsed around them. We don't know how long it had been. I mean, for us, it's been 3 weeks since Easter, but we don't know how these stories lined up. We don't know. It might have just been a day or two since the resurrection, since Jesus' appearance. The Scripture says this is the 3rd time he appeared to them. But we don't know in what manner they've all been there or not been there, and who's been there. And they still don't know what to make of it all. You know, I suppose by the time that this story takes place, I mean, maybe it's a week after the resurrection, a few days. We can assume that all of them there have heard of the resurrection, if perhaps they've not actually experienced it for themselves. Although we do know that several did see him. The upper room story, if we consider, and knowing John's gospel, oftentimes John doesn't write things sequentially, as we've been studying on Wednesday nights, so maybe this happened beforehand. Maybe they haven't seen all of it. But we do know that they haven't fully embraced the significance of the resurrection in their life. Amen. They're still a bit confused and bewildered. So what they do is what any intelligent person would do under such circumstances. They go fishing. Yeah. The text says, Peter announced to the disciples, "I'm going fishing." And they responded with what? "We'll go with you." Yeah. Sounds like a great idea. They went out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee, but what happened? They fished all night and caught nothing. You see, it's a fishing story. And I'm grateful for John's gospel, which says that after Easter, the disciples went fishing. Why? Because it shows their humanness. Their world has changed and changed and changed back again so many times recently that they didn't know what to do or what to say. So they did what they knew what to do. They went fishing. So here they are fishing. And like me, when I fish, they caught nothing. They had worked all night. Now this was not, I'm sure, unfamiliar to them. These guys, a lot of them were professional fishermen. A lot of times professional fishermen fish all night and don't catch anything. I don't know if you've watched any of the shows on the TV, The Greatest Catch and the things like that, where these guys are, they're frustrated more than they're excited. And they'll pull in one big fish, one big haul, and then it makes their whole day or week. But oftentimes these guys are losing things. They're risking their lives. They're losing nets. Things are breaking. Boats don't always hold up. Storms come out of nowhere. We've seen this happen in the disciples' lives many times. But they went back to what was familiar in the midst of all the turmoil. They weren't surprised, probably, at catching nothing, especially considering how things have been going in their lives lately. It was probably par for the course. But here comes the first lesson in this rich, amazing story. The disciples, some of them, were recruited by Jesus to be fishers of men. Jesus, if you remember, said, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." And after the resurrection, in this story symbolically, they're doing what they've been called to do. After the resurrection, they said, "We're going to go fishing." Problem is, they fail at it. They didn't succeed. Maybe they weren't fishing for the right thing. Jesus called them to be fishers of men, not fishers of fish anymore. Regardless, the point is they couldn't do it without Jesus' help. Even in their daily lives, they still couldn't continue on with what they knew, with what they were, without the help of Jesus. So who shows up in the midst of this frustration, in the midst of this despondence, in the midst of this despair? Jesus shows up on the shore. So they look and they see a stranger standing over there. And he asks, "Have you caught anything?" Well, that's what everybody asks a fisherman, right? Are they biting? How's the fish bite? You catch anything today? And what is the typical answer that every fisherman gives, regardless of whether they've had any luck or not? Not much happening out here. That's a pretty canned answer for a fisherman. But the truth is, in their case, they really meant it. There weren't nothing happening out there. They caught nothing. They fished all night and had caught nothing. So the stranger says to them, what? Cast over on the other side. The right side of the boat. They believe him. They do it. And what happens? They catch a whole mess of fish. And when the haul comes up, John says to Peter, "It's the Lord. It's got to be the Lord." There's only one person that I know that can fish like that. How many fish did they pull up in that haul? 153. That's an interesting number. So many that should have torn the nets. 153. Interesting that John would include that detail. Now, again, those of you that have been coming to our Wednesday night Bible studies know that John rarely includes details that vivid and that precise unless he wanted it to mean something. John has done that throughout his gospel numerous times. So 153. These were numbers that were meant to be recognized and certainly had a significance to his target audience. Problem is, we're 2,000 years removed from his target audience. So a lot of these meanings can only be guessed at today. But to be specific, for 153. Now theologians across the centuries have come up with all different kinds of explanations. And some of them are really pretty amazing. You take the number of the Gospels and you multiply it by the number of the Trinity, and then you add it to this, and you add the numbers together, and it becomes this like 153. And it's it's incredible some of the work and the detail that they have come up with. But one explanation, which I think is pretty amazing, and I hope that it's true, but several sources quoted it, including Jerome, who was an Old Testament theologian and writer, said that in the ancient world, there was believed that 153 were the number of species of fish that existed in the oceans. The ancient world believed that 153 different species of fish existed in the ocean. Now, of course, we know today there's probably 153 million species of fish that exist. But to their mindset, and perhaps to the mindset of the readers of this gospel, it said they pulled up 153 fish. What would that have meant to them? One of every kind of fish in the ocean. Now take it literally. It meant that Jesus was the only person in history to catch one of each species with one cast. It's pretty amazing. It's a record likely to not be equal. But I'm sure that we're not supposed to take it literally, but allegorically. So what this is saying is that without Jesus empowering us and guiding us as disciples, we, as they were, are ineffective. We are impotent without Jesus' presence with us. Without Jesus' presence with us, which is what the resurrection makes possible, Jesus and his disciples can bring all of humankind into his kingdom. If every species of fish was represented in a net that didn't tear, then every kingdom of this world can be drawn into the net that Christ throws into this world. All nations of the world, all races, with Jesus' empowerment, everyone in this world can and will be captured by the preaching of the gospel. No one's exempt. No one's exempt. It doesn't matter what race, what color, what creed, what nationality. It doesn't even matter if you believe in God. Amen. Atheists. I have once told an atheist that said, I don't believe in God. I said, well, that's okay. God doesn't believe in you. Why do you know that? Boy. See, this is the way the story opens. This is how this gospel message from Jesus this morning opens about hopelessness. It proclaims that Jesus is with us. Jesus is with us to empower us and to guide us in doing what he's called us to do. And without him, we can't do it. We'll fish all night. We'll work all our lives. And without his help, we'll come up empty-handed. But that's only the first part of the story. You can call perhaps the first part of the story the kettle of fish. Jesus' net doesn't break. And it's big enough for each and every one of us. But the second part of the story is an interesting little detail. The charcoal fire. Now this is the part of the story that I really want to focus on this morning. Let's read it again. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have now caught. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples ventured to question him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. So what happens? The disciples get off the boat and join Jesus on the beach. Jesus is standing by a charcoal fire. Now that's an interesting detail that John included. A charcoal fire. Why would he say a charcoal fire? It's not an ordinary fire. It's not a fire made of driftwood or the things that you would expect to make a fire with on the side of the beach if you're going to cook, but a charcoal fire. Charcoal fires have a distinct smell, don't they? Anybody light up the backyard barbecue? How many of you can still smell the coals being lit?
Oh, yeah.
You know, I can be walking and I can smell a charcoal fire, and instantly I think of someone's barbecuing.
Yeah.
Amen.
Maybe you think of summertime cookouts. Pool parties. Smells have such a distinctive smell.
Yeah.
Charcoal in the air, a lit charcoal fire, I just want a burger so bad when I smell it.
Yeah.
Or barbecue chicken.
Yeah.
Maybe you can even taste the lemonade or still hear the sounds of a baseball game being played in the background. You know, smells have a funny way of doing that. Charcoal always takes me back to my childhood. What did the smell of charcoal and the charcoal fire and the sight of the charcoal and the coals burning do for the disciples? Any ideas? I believe it was tied to their memories as well. Certainly, at least for one of them. You see, the last time we read about a charcoal fire was in the Gospel of John. It was outside the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest. John 18, you go back a few chapters, reads, "Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself." Verse 25, "Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said to him, 'Are you not one of his disciples?' And he denied it and said, 'I am not.' One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, 'Did I not see you in the garden with him?' Peter denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed." See, I tell you, for Peter, the sight and smell of a charcoal fire would bring back that dreadful memory.
That's right.
That instance when they're standing there and Peter is denying Jesus, immediately following his trial and his abuse before his crucifixion. So Jesus is standing there beside a charcoal fire. And Peter, when he sees Jesus from afar, what does he do? He impulsively jumps out of the boat, runs through the shallow water to the shore, and then he gets to shore. And I can imagine him stopping dead in his tracks when the first whiff of smoke from the charcoal fire has greeted his nostrils. See, here's Jesus' opportunity to level Peter, right? Blast him for denying. Point to the charcoal fire and say, "Does this look familiar, Peter?" Ridicule him for his lack of faith. I'm sure Peter expected it. Jesus has been known to do it, especially with Peter. But what do we see Jesus do? Jesus says nothing. He takes the fish and he cooks them breakfast. He takes the bread and he broke it and he gave it to him. And what do they know? They don't even ask who it is. They know. They know for sure, for now, that this is the Lord. Because they're having communion as he promised. They would sit at a table with him in the kingdom when he returned, when he is Lord of all. When all the kingdoms of the world become the kingdoms of our Lord, then we will sit down with Jesus at the banquet and he will break bread. Then the meal's over. And Jesus turns to Peter, and this wasn't in our reading, but this is such an important part of the story. You know this. He turns to Peter, what's he do? He says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter answers, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." Jesus says, "Then feed my lambs." Second time then he asked him, he said, "Simon, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, I love you." Jesus responds, "Then tend my sheep." And the third time he asks him, says, "Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter responds. He says, "Then feed my sheep." Now there's tons of sermons that can be wrapped into all that. But 3 times around a charcoal fire, Peter denied Jesus. 3 times around a charcoal fire, Jesus forgives Peter. See, that's what's happening here. Forgiveness is happening here. Hope is happening here. Restoration of faith is happening here. Feed my sheep means you got your old job back. You are restored. Forgiveness means forgetting the past and starting over again. You see, guilt is a chain. Guilt holds you to your past. Even if you don't talk about it or try to forget it, or even if you successfully suppress it, it still weighs you down. It's still a chain that holds you to your past so that you're not able to live the way you want to live in the present. You may not be able to identify it, but there is something that is ruining your life. Forgiveness means that it no longer weighs you down. He breaks the power of canceled sin. He sets the prisoners free. Feed my sheep means you've got your future back. See, this is the meaning of the charcoal fire. It's a setting for forgiveness.
Yes.
It's a scene for forgiveness. Fish in fire, breakfast amongst friends, restoration and a renewal of the commission and calling to be the fishers of men that he promised them that he would be. See, this is the beauty of this story.
Yeah.
Jesus is back being one of the guys, teaching them about love, teaching them about forgiveness. It's like Steve said, this is Jesus hanging out with his buddies,
Yeah.
bringing everything back together. You know, Jesus got weird towards the end of his mission. You know, in the beginning it was like, let's heal people and let's have nice discussions and let's get followers. And then Jesus started talking about his death. And he started driving people away. And he started getting kind of weird. And now it's Jesus is gone through and completed his mission. And the disciples said, I understand now. This is what it's all about. You had to go through this. We had to do this. Jesus is back to being one of the guys. The story ends with a riddle. And it's about the only time that Jesus uses a riddle after restoring Peter, after offering forgiveness to him. He says, when you were young, you girded yourself and walked where you would. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish to go. Now, what in the world could that mean? The author of the Gospel of John puts it in his own interpretation. He puts it in parentheses that you'll know that it's just his interpretation. But John writes, it was a prediction of Peter's crucifixion. Peter will die like Jesus on a cross in Rome, but Peter will tell the Romans, I am not worthy to die as my Lord died. So in this terrible irony, the executioner does what? Flips the cross upside down. Peter is still crucified, only not like Jesus, not in the manner that his Lord was, but upside down. John says it's a prophecy, a prediction of the way Peter will die. When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, as in the crucifixion. But I think there's more going on here. If we take a look. Look at the riddle again. When you were young, you girded yourself and walked where you would. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird or help you. When we were young, we're like Peter was, right? Confident, brash, boastful, confident of our powers, sure that we can do and have anything in this life. And if you remember, didn't Peter once even say to Jesus, I'll never leave you. Others will betray you, but I will never do that. And yet, Peter left him. See, there's a time in each of our lives when we think we can do anything. You know, we tell little kids as they grow up, you want to be an astronaut? Absolutely. You want to be president of the United States? Of course. You can do and be whatever you want to be. And we believe that. And that's good. That's good to be confident. But the truth is when we get older, we start to realize there are limitations to our abilities. I will never be a professional athlete. I mean, maybe I could have if I really, really worked hard. But there's a good chance that even if I'd worked really hard, I still wouldn't have made it. Because there's just something about certain people that have a certain giftedness to do that. I thought it was the ice cream man coming. I was getting excited. See how fast I can do a 100-yard dash to the ice cream man. When you're young, you believe you can do and be anything. But sooner or later you fail. You fall on your face and you learn that you cannot do it all. You need someone's help. You need someone's forgiveness maybe. You need someone's patience. You need someone's grace. We talked about the fruits this morning that Jesus talks about. The fruits that we need, not just in our lives, but we often need it from other people. See, this is exactly the way it was with the disciples. Days before the crucifixion, in fact, days before this scene takes place, the disciples were walking around with Jesus towards Jerusalem. And Jesus was going to be crucified, and he even made that plainly clear. And what were the disciples doing? Boasting, bragging, competing with each other as to which one would be the greatest. Completely missing the point. Now look at them. Just a few days later, maybe a week. And what's happened? Every one of them have failed to deliver on their boasting. Every one of them failed. Peter is just the representative disciple.
Yeah.
I mean, he denied him, but they all failed. He's the most likable of all the bumblers, but he's still a bumbler, just like us. See, I believe this is what this means. This fishing and catching nothing, and then Jesus showing up to show them how to do it. It means that we need grace to do what we're called to do. At some point in our life, when we're able to say, I am a sinner, and I cannot do this on my own, come, Jesus, and help me, that's when we grow up. Maybe it happens when we discover a weakness in our own lives. We don't want anyone else to know about it, so we lie about it. We find some way to cover it up. For a while, we think we're successful in doing this because nobody says anything. Or if they do, our denials cause them to back off. And pretty soon, we're spending an awful lot of time and energy on our life pretending, right? Cover-ups after cover-ups. And then one day, what happens? The house of cards we built comes crashing down. We mess up and somebody sees it. They let us know, though, that it doesn't matter. You've exposed yourself as imperfect and it's okay. You're reaching out your hand to that person at that moment and they take it. It's like being girded, that Jesus says. It's like being carried. It's the most wonderful feeling when we reach out for help and we receive it. When we reach out for forgiveness and it's granted. When we reach out for hope and we receive it. It may be that you reach a point in your life when you look back and realize how dependent on others that you've really truly been. We may boast about our self-reliance. We may brag about our own achievements. A lot of us get caught up in this great American myth of self-reliance and believe all that stuff about it being up to us. You read books. And you go to motivational seminars that say, you can do it by yourself. But one day, you grow old and you realize, I didn't do this on my own. You may take the credit for it, you may brag on it a little bit, but you didn't do it by yourself. From time to time, this will apply to all of us. We've had to put out our hand and someone else has girded it. The text says that when that happens, it happens when you grow old. I think perhaps it means not when you grow old, but that's the time when you grow up. Not necessarily growing old. I think it's a sign of maturity. It's the realization that I cannot live my life on my own. Remember the story of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. I think it's more correct to say that it's the beginning of Paul's conversion. It began on the road and it continued long after that. You see, before the Damascus road, by his own confession, Paul says, I was self-righteous. You know what? In that era, that wasn't a bad thing to be. Think about it. Everyone was expected to be self-righteous because the goal in life was clearly stated and the way to get there was clearly known. You got there by yourself. It was the equivalent today of being a self-made man. He was successful by any standard that his society could lift up. He was a self-made person. Follow the law, abide by the rules, don't break them, and you'll be the best person. And God will like you the most. But see what happened on that road to Damascus. He was knocked down and he was blinded. He held out his hands and literally somebody had to lead him. He had been blinded. When he got to Damascus, some more people took his hands. In Damascus, the Christians reached out and touched him. And when he got his vision back, he suddenly could see things that he had never seen before. That they had been there all along, but he had never seen them. That he lived by grace and not by his own strength. Later he would write to the Roman church, he said, I did it, but not I. It was the grace of God working through me. See, when you're young, you gird yourself. And when you're old, someone else strengthens you. And when you're old, you fall down a few times. And when you mature, you discover the limits of your life and discover that you haven't gotten this far by yourself. We need each other. We need people. And we need God. Maybe you remember this scene. I'm sure you've watched the video. The 1992 Olympics in Barcelona. During the 400-meter race, a sprinter from Great Britain named Derek Redmond rounded the curve. All of a sudden, he fell on the track. He got up, holding his thigh. You see, he had torn his hamstring muscle. He He started to inch along towards the finish line, but he could barely move. The officials came out on the track and surrounded him. They tried to move him off the track, but he insisted on finishing the race. But suddenly a man came out of the stands. It was Derek's father. He put his hand out to his son. His son reached out and took his hand, and the father girded him, strengthened him. Leaning on his father's arm, Derek and his father finished the race together. Such a powerful image. Let's watch the video one more time. Afterwards, a reporter asked Derek's father, he said, "Why did you do that? Why did you come out of the stands?" And the dad responded, he said, "Because we started this together, and we're going to finish this together." What a great response from his father. Sure sounds a lot like our Heavenly Father, who promises to never leave us. We're going to fall. We're going to get picked up. And He's going to continue to help us. The disciples in their boat fishing. A stranger on the shore tells them where to find fish. Couldn't do it on their own. Then He renews the life that He gave them years before. He gives it back to them. He just appears from nowhere and gives their life back to them. A life that they had thought they had thrown away. They now know that they could not have done it by themselves, because it was He who started it with them, and it is He who has to finish it in them. You see, this story is a whole lot bigger than just an old fisherman's tale. This is a story about life. The life that the disciples were called to live, and the life that each of us are called to live as well. You see, the best part about this life, the best part about this story, the best part about our faith is that we're not alone.
Amen.
Take a look around the boat with you today. Take a look at everyone here that God has called us to fish with. See, we've got a whole bunch of fishing buddies here.
Amen.
A whole bunch of people here. around us to help us out. Friends that will stick with us and love us. And most importantly is this, we don't need to worry about the direction of the ship. Why? Because Jesus is at the captain's
That's
wheel.
right. Amen.
Jesus wants to steer the boat. Why? So that we can be free to do the catching.
Amen.
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 Amen.